Beyond the last row of houses, past the tree line where public roads gave way to private drives, another kind of settlement once rose from the landscape. It had its own water tower, its own power plant, its own miles of underground steam tunnels. It had a fire brigade, a cemetery, a chapel, and a railway spur that delivered coal by the ton. What it did not have was a name on any ordinary map. This was the psychiatric hospital as a city unto itself. Across Britain, Europe, and the United States, institutions like Danvers in Massachusetts, Willard in New York, and Whittingham in Lancashire sprawled across hundreds and sometimes thousands of acres. Whittingham, opened in 1873, would eventually hold more than 3,000 patients and employ a comparable workforce, making it one of the largest asylums in England. These were not clinics. They were towns, complete with populations that rivaled the surrounding countryside. The scale is difficult to grasp today. A single campus might contain dozens of buildings connected by covered walkways, feeding thousands of residents 3 meals a day from kitchens that baked their own bread and slaughtered their own livestock. Patients rose to bells, worked shifts, attended services, and were buried, when they died, in graves marked only by numbers. Generations passed within the perimeter. And here lies the central paradox. These places were conceived as instruments of healing, designed by reformers who believed that beauty, order, and open air could mend a troubled mind. The grand facades and manicured grounds were meant to reassure, to restore, to return the afflicted to society made whole. Instead, many became closed worlds, isolated by distance and by silence, where the promise of cure hardened into the fact of permanence. To understand how such places came to exist, we must go back to the men and women who imagined them. They were not builders of prisons. They were idealists, armed with blueprints and a radical conviction that the very shape of a building could reach into the human psyche. Their philosophy had a name, and it began with a simple, dangerous belief about what it meant to treat the insane. In 1841, a schoolteacher named Dorothea Dix walked into a Massachusetts jail and found people with mental illness confined in unheated cages, chained, beaten, and forgotten. What she saw launched a crusade. Over the following decades, Dix petitioned legislatures across America, testifying to conditions that shamed lawmakers into action. Her argument was simple. The mad were not criminals, and they deserved not restraint but treatment. This was the age of moral treatment, a philosophy imported from European reformers like Philippe Pinel, who had famously struck the chains from patients in Paris. The idea held that madness was not permanent depravity but a disorder that kindness, routine, and a humane environment could correct. Central to this vision was a physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride. In 1854, he published a treatise that became gospel for asylum builders. The Kirkbride plan called for buildings arranged in a distinctive staggered wing formation, so that every ward received sunlight and fresh air. Wings stepped back from the center in echelon, offset like the vanes of a fan, ensuring cross-ventilation and long views over cultivated grounds. Kirkbride specified everything: ceiling heights, corridor widths, the placement of windows, the maximum number of patients per building, which he set at around 250. Architecture itself was therapy. A patient surrounded by order, Kirkbride argued, would internalize that order. Elevated sites, ornamental gardens, and sweeping lawns were not decoration, but medicine, meant to soothe agitation and lift the spirits. Dozens of these palaces of the mind rose across the American landscape between the 1840s and the 1880s, their Gothic and Italianate towers dominating the horizon. And crucially, daily labor was woven into the cure. Work was believed to discipline the wandering mind, to anchor it to purpose and season. A patient who tended a field, kneaded dough, or scrubbed a floor was, in theory, being healed by the very rhythm of the task. This principle demanded space, and it demanded soil. The healing institution would need to feed itself, and so it turned to the land. Beyond the ornamental gardens lay hundreds of working acres, and there the daily labor of thousands began at dawn. At first light, the fields came alive. Patients in work clothes moved between rows of potatoes and cabbages, drove teams of horses, and carried milk pails across yards slick with morning dew. The psychiatric hospital was, above all, a farm. Willard State Hospital in New York cultivated more than 1,400 acres. Many institutions maintained herds of dairy cattle, numbering in the hundreds, piggeries, poultry houses, orchards heavy with apples, and greenhouses that grew vegetables through the winter. The scale of production was staggering. A large asylum might harvest tens of thousands of bushels of produce annually, bottle its own milk, and cure its own hams. This served two masters. The first was therapeutic doctrine. Agricultural labor embodied the ideals of moral treatment. It was purposeful. It followed the natural cycle of the seasons, and it kept the body occupied and the mind grounded. Physicians prescribed farm work the way they might prescribe rest, matching patients to tasks they believed suited their condition. A man who could not sit still might be sent to dig. A woman deemed calm might tend the hen house. The second master was economics. Feeding thousands of mouths every day was ruinously expensive, and legislatures were reluctant to fund it. A hospital that grew its own food, raised its own meat, and preserved its own harvest could survive on a fraction of the cost. Patient labor was free. This arithmetic became irresistible. The farms grew larger, and so did the reliance on the unpaid hands that worked them. By the early 20th century, some institutions had become substantial agricultural enterprises, exporting surplus produce and winning prizes at county fairs for their livestock. The line between therapy and necessity blurred until it vanished. Was a patient laboring 12 hours in a beet field being treated or exploited? The answer depended on who you asked, and few asked the patients. And the fields were only part of it. Inside the buildings, behind steam-fogged windows and swinging doors, another vast machine of labor churned day and night. The laundries, kitchens, and workshops needed hands as badly as the farms, and the patients supplied them. Inside the institution, the work never stopped. In basement laundries, women fed sheets through steam-driven mangles and stirred vats of scalding water, washing linen for thousands. The volume was industrial. A single hospital laundry might process tens of thousands of pieces each week, drying them on lines strung through cavernous halls. The air was thick with lye and steam, and the labor went on regardless of season. In the kitchens, patients peeled potatoes by the sackful, stirred cauldrons of soup, and hauled trays down long corridors to the wards. Bakeries produced hundreds of loaves daily, the ovens fired before dawn. Elsewhere, the self-sufficient city hummed with craft. There were carpentry shops that built and repaired the institution's furniture, tailoring rooms that stitched patient uniforms, cobblers who resold shoes, and upholsterers, brush makers, basket weavers, and printers who produced the hospital's own forms and reports. Some institutions ran their own brickworks, firing the very bricks that built new wards. The occupational therapy movement, gathering force in the early 20th century under figures like Eleanor Clark Slagle, gave this labor a clinical language. Slagle championed habit training, the idea that structured activity could rebuild a shattered mind. Weaving, sewing, and woodwork became prescribed treatments, and craft shops were reframed as therapeutic workshops. But the language could not hide the arithmetic beneath it. The same patients whose labor was called therapy also kept institution running at almost no cost. A hospital that clothed, fed, and cleaned itself with unpaid patient hands saved enormous sums, and administrators knew it. The most capable patients, ironically, were often the least likely to be discharged because their labor was too valuable to lose. A skilled seamstress or a reliable farmhand became indispensable, and indispensability was a kind of sentence. Here the healing ideal collided with institutional self-interest, and self-interest usually won. Work that was meant to restore independence instead deepened dependence, binding patients ever tighter to the place. For many, this arrangement did not last months. It lasted years. It lasted lifetimes. Behind the workshop doors were people who had entered as patients and become, without ever choosing it, permanent citizens of the hospital city. The records tell it plainly. Admission dates in the 1890s. Discharge columns left blank until a death date appeared decades later. In institution after institution, patients arrived expecting a stay of weeks or months and remained for the rest of their lives. At Willard, the average length of stay stretched across many years, and some residents lived within the walls for 30, 40, even 50 years. They grew old there. They died there. When the Willard suitcase cases were rediscovered in an attic in 1995, they revealed the lives behind the numbers. More than 400 suitcases, packed with the belongings of patients who entered and never left, held photographs, letters, tools, sewing kits, and clothing folded neatly for a homecoming that never came. Each case was a life interrupted, its owner absorbed into the routine of the ward, until the outside world dissolved from memory. Permanence crept in quietly. A patient might improve but have nowhere to go, no family willing to receive them, no home still standing. Another might be too useful in the laundry or the fields to release. Some had been committed for reasons that were never truly medical. Unwed mothers, epileptics, immigrants who spoke no English, the merely difficult or inconvenient. Once inside, the machinery of the institution rarely reversed itself. Within the walls, lives took on their own shape. Patients formed friendships, attended the same chapel services for decades, worked the same shift at the same bench, walked the same paths across the same lawns. Identity reorganized itself around the institution's rhythms, the morning bell, the meal trays, the seasons of the farm. For people who had lost their place in the outside world, the ward became the only world, and its routines became a kind of home, however narrow. This was the quiet tragedy at the heart of the hospital city. Places designed to return people to society had become societies of their own, holding their populations indefinitely. And as the decades passed, more arrived than ever departed. The buildings that Kirkbride had capped at 250 souls began to fill far beyond their limits. The wards grew crowded, then crowded again, until the healing vision itself began to break under the sheer weight of numbers. The vision required space. Kirkbride had insisted no asylum hold more than 250 patients, each with light, air, and a view of the grounds. But by 1900, hospitals built for hundreds were housing thousands. New York's Pilgrim State Hospital, opened in 1931 on Long Island, would eventually shelter more than 13,000 people, making it the largest psychiatric institution on earth. Milledgeville in Georgia swelled past 12,000. The healing corridors filled, then overfilled. Beds appeared in day rooms. Beds appeared in hallways. Beds touched beds, until the airy wards Dorothea Dix had fought for became warehouses of bodies. The arithmetic never balanced. Admissions outpaced discharges year after year because few patients ever left. A single attendant might supervise 60, 80, 100 residents. Wards designed for 40 held 90. The elderly, the epileptic, the alcoholic, the merely inconvenient, all poured through the same gates and none flowed out. State legislatures, facing rising costs, cut budgets rather than build new campuses. Staff-to-patient ratios collapsed. Physicians who had once known every name now oversaw entire buildings they rarely entered. The farms that had promised self-sufficiency could not feed populations this size, and the workshops meant to restore dignity became simply the machinery that kept overwhelmed institutions running. Restraint replaced routine. Where moral treatment had prescribed gentle occupation, understaffed wards prescribed sedation, seclusion, and leather cuffs. The straitjacket, the padded cell, and later the wet pack and insulin coma spread through hospitals that no longer had hands enough for anything kinder. Hygiene deteriorated. Diseases like tuberculosis and dysentery moved easily through crowded dormitories. Winters were cold, summers unbearable, and the smell of overcrowded wards became a defining feature staff never forgot. The founding dream of order had inverted itself entirely. The spacious sanctuary had become a container for people society preferred not to see. By the 1940s, more than 500,000 Americans lived inside these institutions, a hidden nation behind brick and fence. Yet the public knew almost nothing of what happened within. The hospital stood miles from town, ringed by farmland and silence, their conditions sealed away from ordinary eyes. What was happening inside those walls would remain unseen, until outsiders finally forced their way through the gates. They were built to be remote. The 19th century planners chose rural sites deliberately, believing distance from cities offered peace and fresh air. But isolation cut both ways. A hospital surrounded by 500 acres of farmland was also a hospital no journalist wandered past, no neighbor overheard, no family could easily reach. Visiting hours were brief and monitored. Letters were sometimes censored. For decades, the interiors of these institutions existed beyond the reach of public knowledge, protected less by malice than by geography and indifference. Then the walls cracked. During World War II, conscientious objectors assigned to work as attendants in place of military service witnessed the wards firsthand. Horrified, they documented what they saw. In 1946, Life magazine published Albert Maysles' exposé, Bedlam 1946, with photographs from Pennsylvania's Byberry and Ohio's Cleveland State Hospital showing naked men huddled on bare floors, filth, and neglect that shocked a nation. The images were compared openly to concentration camps. 2 years later, Albert Deutsch published The Shame of the States, a book documenting hospital after hospital in unflinching detail. In 1948, the film The Snake Pit brought fictionalized asylum conditions to millions of theatergoers. The doors, so long shut, were being pried open one revelation at a time. Investigations followed. State commissions toured facilities they had funded but never inspected. Reporters found patients who had entered decades earlier for conditions no longer considered illnesses, forgotten by families and records alike. Grand juries convened. Photographs of restraint devices and overflowing wards appeared in newspapers that readers could no longer ignore. The comforting fiction that these were peaceful sanctuaries dissolved under documentary evidence. The public that had looked away was forced, briefly, to look. Yet exposure alone changed little at first. Buildings remained overcrowded. Budgets remained thin. The scandal created outrage, but not immediately a solution, because no one yet knew what to do with 500,000 people. The institutions had become too large to reform and too full to close. Something more fundamental would have to shift, in medicine, in law, and in the very idea of where the mentally ill belonged. That transformation was coming, and it would empty the hospital cities almost entirely. Change arrived in a small pink pill. In 1954, the drug chlorpromazine, sold as Thorazine, entered American hospitals. For the first time, a medication could quiet the symptoms of severe psychosis well enough that patients might function outside a locked ward. Other antipsychotics followed. Doctors who had managed disorder with restraints now managed it with prescriptions, and the argument that patients needed lifelong confinement began to weaken. The chemistry of the wards had changed, and so, soon, with their populations, policy followed medicine. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy, whose sister Rosemary had been institutionalized after a lobotomy, signed the Community Mental Health Act, promising a national network of local centers to replace the great state hospitals. The vision was humane. Treatment near home, not in some distant farm-fringed city. Federal programs like Medicaid, established in 1965, created financial incentives that pushed states to move patients out, since community care could draw federal dollars that hospital care could not. The emptying accelerated. From a peak of roughly 560,000 residents in state hospitals in 1955, the census fell steadily, decade after decade, until fewer than 100,000 remained by the 1990s. The hospital cities that had taken generations to fill drained in a single lifetime. Wards closed. Farms fell silent. The self-contained worlds behind the walls simply ceased to have inhabitants. But the promised community centers were never fully built. Congress funded only a fraction of the intended network. Patients released after 20, 30, 40 years inside emerged into cities they no longer recognized, without the routines, the familiar faces, or the sheltering structure that had defined their lives. Some found halfway houses in support. Many did not. They drifted into single-room hotels, into families unequipped to care for them, into jails, and onto the streets. The nation had emptied its asylums, but had not built the world it was supposed to receive them. What remained were the buildings themselves, enormous and suddenly useless, standing empty on their vast acreage. Miles of corridor, hundreds of rooms, silent farms and shuttered chapels. The hospital cities were not gone. They were simply abandoned, waiting to tell their story to whoever came looking. They stand across the landscape still, these emptied cities. Kings Park on Long Island, its 13-story Building 93 rising above overgrown grounds. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, its Kirkbride wings looming until developers converted them in 2006. Weston State in West Virginia, now toured as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, its stone corridors echoing with visitors' footsteps. Buffalo's Richardson Complex, reborn as a hotel and museum. Some campuses were leveled entirely, their farms sold, their names surviving only on old maps. Others crumbled slowly, windows shattered, roofs collapsing, ivy claiming the brick. The endings varied. Preservationists fought to save the grand facades that once symbolized reform, arguing that the architecture itself was history worth keeping. Developers saw acreage and views. Ghost tour operators saw profit in old fear. And beneath the ground of many campuses lay the numbered graves of patients who died there and were never claimed. Thousands of them, marked only by iron tags. In recent years, families and volunteers have worked to restore real names to those anonymous plots, an effort to return identity to people the institution had reduced to case numbers. What the ruins remember is contradiction. They remember genuine ambition, the belief of Kirkbride and Dix that beauty, order, and honest work could mend a broken mind. They remember the farms that fed thousands, and the workshops that gave shape to empty days. But they remember, too, the overcrowding, the restraints, the forgotten lifetimes measured in decades behind fences. They hold both the promise and the failure in the same weathered walls. We look at these places now and see only decay, a favorite subject for photographers and the curious. But that decay obscures the original intention, which was neither cruel nor careless at its birth. These were monuments to an idea about human suffering, about isolation and the mind, about what people owe to those who cannot fully care for themselves. The planners believed that the mentally ill suffered most from being cast out and cut off, and so they answered with something extraordinary and doomed. They built cities to cure loneliness,